Hi everyone, we are now in the midst of week 11. You're thinking a lot about assessment. First of all, because we're getting closer to the end of this course and you're probably thinking about how do you fulfill the assignments for this course and what are the ways that you're being assessed. But also because for many of you, you're at the point in your work with your own learners where you're probably thinking about, well, how do I give them feedback in the ways that they're participating in class, that they're fulfilling their obligations, working through activities. For those of you who are working in day schools, you have more formal mechanisms for giving assessments, for giving feedback, most probably either parent-teacher conferences, report cards, tests, formal grading. For those of you who are working in less formal settings, especially with adults, where it's usually a voluntary participation in a course, you might be wondering, well, how does one offer an assessment? So I wanted to comment on some of the items that you've been posting into your discussion board, some of the questions that you've been posing. And tie together some of the strands from the last few weeks of problem-based learning, cooperative learning, and assessment. So first of all, one of you spoke in one of our discussion boards in the last few weeks about how perhaps through problem-based learning one could engage our learners in some real-life work, something that feels applicable to their everyday participation in our settings. For example, one of you wrote about having your learners create the elements of a Torah service, which is definitely could be posed as problem-based learning if one were to have a really rich guiding essential question, such as, well, you can think of what the essential question would be, but perhaps one example might be, how is a Torah service a means for communal participation? That might be, for example, your essential question to your learners, and one that they would be exploring through problem-based learning. Of course, many of us have been to Torah services that feel quite frontal and where there's not a lot of participation from the community. But as we know from our tradition, at its core, it was a communal event with lots of participation. So perhaps that's what you're posing to your fourth graders, for example. And one of you wrote back on the discussion board, well, how does that allow for people learning actually discrete facts? How do we know that people aren't just learning what they learn from themselves? How do we know that there's concrete skills and facts that they're learning? So I want to tie that to our discussion this week of rubrics. Even if you don't create a formal rubric for your learners, let's say you're asking them to engage in a 3-week exercise where they have to create the various components of a Torah service and consider this question as how we engage participants in communal activity of the Torah service. Well, you as the educator can decide in advance, well, what would they have to create in small groups or as individuals to fulfill this assignment? For example, perhaps you would tell them, okay, you have to decide on 3 verses that you would ask questions about to the community. Perhaps the leader of the Torah service has to ask 3 questions about 3 verses in the Torah service. Or perhaps you have to tell them that they have to integrate into their creation of the Torah service 2 prayers, and they have to translate those prayers or 3 words from their Hebrew tefillot into English. Or you tell them that they need to be able to correctly be able to take apart and put together the dressings for the Torah, or do Hagba and Glila. Or they have to be able to say correctly what date of the week is it. Is it Yom Sheni or Yom Chamishi? These are just examples, but you as the educator, if you are creating something like this, that is going to answer this question of how do we engage the community. What are, maybe you tell them they have to find 5 elements of the Torah service that would allow for communal engagement. Ways that they go up and kiss the Torah or dance around the Torah. This is completely up to you. That would be one way of ensuring that your students are all learning discrete skills or facts. Now, of course, there's going to be lots of room for interpretation from your learners. Not every time that you conduct this activity is it going to happen in every way, in the same way. And also, let's say that you broke down your participants into small groups. You had 4 groups working on this problem-based learning activity. Not every group is going to approach it in the same way. Well, that's where constructivism comes in. You want your learners to be able to take responsibility for their own learning and make meaning on their own. Again, this goes back to the thing that I constantly keep reinforcing, that you as the educator can provide the framework, and then there's room for your learners to take it in various directions. One other example that comes to mind is, let's say that you were trying to work with your learners on them understanding that each week there's a different parsha. Perhaps they would have to find ways to create a Devar Torah for the week, in which there would be questions they would propose to the community about the parsha. Again, just another example. I think also this is about letting go of the idea that everyone learns everything every time we teach about, say, the Torah service. You're not going to be able to teach everything. Think about this course. In the upcoming assignment on questions and answers, all of your assignments are going to be slightly different, and you're all not going to explore every level of Bloom's taxonomy. We're not all going to be able to integrate everything from our learning from the semester. So we have to let go of that. I'm allowing some room for each of you to take it in the direction that you feel will be most meaningful for you. But we have to let go of that notion of everyone's going to learn everything and everyone's going to learn everything in exactly the same way. We need to make some choices about what we'll focus on. As always, I want to remind you that's the core of constructivism. Constructivism is a social process. So you too need to decide as educators what's most important to you. Sometimes it might be about transmission of particular facts, and you will engage in some frontal learning, and that's not a bad word. But I imagine for many of you, you're trying to engage your learners in a social process, and then we put a premium on developing the context for that social process to take place. That's where problem-based learning and cooperative learning come in. Those are mechanisms for engaging our learners in a social process, making meaning of material, if that's important to you. I just want to say a few things about your comments you made about the problem-based learning that you did, the object-based lesson, and you tried out cooperative learning the last few weeks as well. These are always segues to vehicles for asking higher order questions. Being able to, certainly in problem-based learning, I hope you can see this ties to our unit on question asking and question answering, that with problem-based learning, you can ask some higher order questions. The idea is that you are, and I think many of you saw this and commented on this in these discussion forums, that you're helping your learners to become co-investigators. Again, going back to this idea that they're taking responsibility for their own learning. So for example, I loved looking at the photos of the objects that you used in your object-based learning. Rather than presenting, this is a Kiddush cup, this is a tallis, this is an ornament for the Torah, these are candlesticks. You're getting your learners to ask questions about what are these objects, how are they used, how do they look similar or dissimilar to objects that we've already explored through our learning together. We have Hanukkah coming up. So what might it be like to take 3 different menorahs, place them in front of your learners, and ask them to explore how they're the same and how they're different. Many menorahs today don't conform to the actual halachic law, the halakha around what makes for a halachic menorah. And we might decide that's okay, but what would it be like if you were exploring some of the particular rules around what a menorah needs to look like, or how we need to place the candles, or where we need to be able to place the menorah, where it's most likely to place the menorah to fulfill the obligations of publicizing the miracle. Would it be able to fit in a window or in a doorway? If you were to explore 3 or 4 of these laws or customs, then having them be able to use these objects to talk about, do they conform or not conform to the rabbi's ideas of what would fulfill Hilchot Chanukah. So that would be a way of doing some application activities, some comprehension activities, exploring different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, the same with cooperative learning. So again, these are just some ways to tie together the strands of our last few weeks. As you saw from my feedback on your papers, as you continue forward, I want you to continue to make these types of connections. I really enjoyed reading your papers. You drew on the readings quite well, but in some cases, there were some missed opportunities for making further connections to our prior learning. That's what you'll want to be doing through your next paper and through your portfolio, making these connections. That is the basis for constructivism. So making connections back to the Brooks and Brooks. When you're talking about question and answering, making connections back to some of the other things we've talked about, so they don't just seem like discrete weeks that stay in their containers. And that's what we're trying to do for our learners as well. I look forward to talking with you further and continuing with you.